Welcome to Season 2 of It Doesn't Hurt to Ask, brought to you by the Fundraising Lab. In each episode, we talk to shift disturbers in the world of philanthropy. These are folks who are shaking up the traditional fundraising practices. On this episode, Cathy talks to Sharon Redsky of Redsky Fundraising. We hope you enjoy the interview and gain new perspectives. Here's Cathy.
Sharon Redsky is principal at Redsky Fundraising. You've got extensive experience in Indigenous organizations, and you're an award winner, YWCA's Women of Distinction Award, the Community Champion Award, so congratulations. You're a mom, a sister, an auntie, and you're loved and owned by two adorable dogs. Listen, before we get into it, I do just want to say that while the magic of technology is bringing people together from many places, I'm speaking to you from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm grateful for the care that Indigenous peoples have exercised that has allowed me to settle and work here. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which I think is a wonderfully ironic name, given how the First Nations people of this area have been treated. That treaty was first signed with the British Crown in 1725, and it recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title to lands and resources and established the rules for what was supposed to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Sharon, do you want to talk about where you're from?
So, bonjour, Wajish Benesi, Indigenous Kas, a Tik Totem. So I'm Sharon Redsky, and I'm on the Treaty 1 territory, which is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I want to recognize Treaty 3, Shoal Lake First Nation, which is the community that I'm a part of that supplies the water to Winnipeg. And you know what, Cathy, I am so glad to be here. I didn't realize I was here first. That's so exciting. I just want to let you know how much I appreciate the work that you've been doing. I know that, generosity and being able to share and create really important spaces for, these important dialogues is really critical. And so I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for saying that, Sharon. Okay, so there is this, sort of new, broader awareness among non-Indigenous Canadians right now that is calling on us to reflect and address, on the practices and effects of colonization. And I would say that we in our sector are also being called upon to do philanthropy differently, in effect, to decolonize philanthropy. And I know that I'm learning, and I'm probably spending more time unlearning, and maybe the unlearning is probably more important. But you're on the front line of this. And there's so much to talk about, but where do you want to start? We talked about a few things. Do you want to maybe start with some of the stats that you shared with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what, first, I just want to be able to, say that I don't speak on behalf of the Indigenous community. I'm really here just, speaking about my experiences. And so one of the things I think that's really important for everybody to know is that, Indigenous people have been philanthropists and are philanthropists, have, really focusing on, taking care of each other and taking care of Mother Earth. And was really, years ago through colonization and legislation that actually criminalized giving, and so communities who would share, and the value of reciprocity, I think, is something that communities can teach, and share, because it's so important. And so it just seems that the government criminalized that, and they were very deliberate in their acts, in policies and legislation. And so it's been devastating just learning, coming across that, as a fundraiser, always wondering, how did we get here? And I think that piece of history is really important for the sector to understand, because, we need to learn from the past, and we need to be able to, walk together and create a system that's going to work for everybody. And so getting to those statistics, back in 2018, I was part of the Association of Fundraising Professionals. They had, a project where, it was an opportunity to work with some mentors, and, they brought together, I think, 22 people from across Canada. And, part of it was, getting connected with a mentor who was in the sector, but it was also working on a project. And so at that time, I'd always wondered, how come our Indigenous organizations who are at the front line doing like incredible work, really through a holistic lens, aren't getting enough of the resources. And so it was at that time I put together with my mentor, Joan Blight, a survey to answer those questions, those nagging questions that I've always had. And so we broke it down into sections. One was people felt in the sector that philanthropy had a role to play in reconciliation. The second piece was, what was their knowledge about the truth and reconciliation? What do they feel like some of the barriers are, and what do they hope for the future? And it was, for me, it was really kind of informative because it answered, a lot of those questions that I had. And I was happy to hear that, everybody agreed that they felt that, philanthropy did have a role to play, but they felt that some of the barriers were the lack of understanding. They don't have a connection to the community. And what they felt some of the things moving forward was about building respectful relationships. So I think that was really good. And then I had an opportunity to meet with Mark Bloomberg. And so, we had a few conversations because the other piece that I was always wondering about why there wasn't more research about how much money actually goes to Indigenous organizations. And so, after a few conversations, with Mark, we were able to put together some information looking at 2018 and everything's available through Canada Revenue Agency. And we had Wanda who helped out as well.
Sorry, that's Wanda Bracupe from from Indigenous Peoples
Resilient Fund. Yes. Yeah. And so we had an opportunity to go through the heaps of information and pick out, as best as possible what we felt would qualify as an Indigenous organization. And, in that finding, found out at the time that for every $178, $1 was going to Indigenous communities. So, I think there's definitely room for improvement, but it isn't just about that. I think it's about, I think a lot about, what decolonizing means to me. And it's really about understanding that the goal of the government was to assimilate Indigenous people. And, they wanted everybody to think like them, be like them. And we know that that didn't work. Thankfully, our communities were resilient, in spite of it all.
The Fundraising Lab believes in building community, a community that helps each other, because being in a small to mid-sized shop can be somewhat isolating. This is why we've made the Spark community free. But don't believe us. Listen to some of our existing members. Here's what Maureen had to say. It's a great way to have peer support and another fundraiser to bounce ideas off of. It's especially important as I'm the one and only fundraiser at my organization. And Deb. As a newish fundraiser, I joined to get up-to-the-minute advice and to network. This group is my go-to resource. Keep this group going. It's an amazing platform. So what better way to grow your network than to join a community? And yes, it's free. Sign up now at fundraisinglab.com/spark.
I feel really strongly too that the sector has a role to play. And, like a lot of other people, I didn't set out to be a fundraiser and kind of came into the sector. And the one thing that I absolutely love about the sector is, the values we all have, about the common good. And so all of that, I have a lot of hope that if anybody can, make a difference, it's the people who, work in this sector and all of those, mechanisms. And I think that, it's really important we continue to have this dialogue. If needing to learn more, then we need to create more time for people to have a better understanding of the history.
So that leads me to wonder, how did you fall into the sector?
Well, I worked in non-for-profit. We realized that, one of the ways in order to achieve a lot of the outcomes that we were trying to get to was to get support. Spent a lot of time working on government grants and kind of led to foundation grants. And then, I didn't even realize until I started, investigating and asking questions, how big the sector is. I had absolutely no idea. And so it was, a big learning curve for me, but it was really important. And I do have to say, growing up, because my mom went to residential school, and, it was something that she never really spoke about, which I think is the case for a lot of individuals. And, so it was pretty challenging growing up in that environment. And, my life could have gone down a very different path, but it was feeling a sense of belonging, especially being connected to Indigenous organizations and having opportunities to learn my culture was really, I have no doubt, saved my life. And so knowing what it did for me just made the work in a lot of our Indigenous nonprofit organizations more meaningful because I knew what impact, it could have. And so, just working in the sector began my journey looking at fundraising. I have a lot to learn still in the sector. And because, I think it's one of those sectors that evolves. And so the evolution that I see moving forward is to be more inclusive and for it to reflect, our communities and our values.
Yeah. And I think so there's some interesting stuff going on. I mean, I talk a lot about social change philanthropy, which I distinguish from sort of more traditional philanthropy. Anyway, I talk a lot about social change philanthropy. And what I would say is that organizations that are involved in trying to bring about social change have a harder time raising money than organizations that are perhaps seen as more mainstream or more traditional, because, there's this book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And so if we're trying to affect social change, we're asking people to change and people don't like to change. So, raising money for change is a little bit harder.
Yeah, I've seen, and I'm really hoping that things will start to evolve because there's just so much value, in working with a lot of local organizations because they have such a direct impact on communities. And one of my sisters, Diane, has always shared with me, and I learned from her that, if you really want to change somebody's life, invest in women. It'll have an immediate impact on their families and their communities. I think that there's certainly a lot of room for growth. And I had the experience working for an organization called the Mama Wichita Center. And so they've been around for, 38 years now, I think. And it's an Indigenous organization that started back in the 80s with 10 people. And now it's an organization, that has close to 200 staff. So it's really growing. And the beauty of it is, they hired from community. And so tons of volunteers. But anyway, we were working on one project where, we wanted to be able to demonstrate that, if you invested in keeping families together, that not only is that the right thing to do, but it actually saves the government money. And so we had, through a partnership with the foundation, a family who was interested in supporting it and actually spent the time to come out to the community, get to know, what the program is about and the organization. And what was nice was it wasn't only the donor itself, but the children and the grandchildren. And so I think it really gets down to building authentic relationships. And I know that takes time, but it sure is worth the effort, and I just think about how as fundraisers, how talented everybody is and, how many processes and mechanisms are set up so we can understand donors. And I do think that, if we apply those same tools to building partnerships, with some of our local Indigenous communities, as well as our Indigenous organizations, that we'll be farther ahead.
One comment and then a question. It sounds like with the donor you talked about, that was really a donor as partner versus donor as just like a ATM or just donor writing a check. So, and I think that's what I see a lot in the world of social change philanthropy, that donors are increasingly prepared to really understand the organization.
Yeah. And I do think that, in doing that, we get to share the incredible resiliency of communities and how communities, are very unique in getting things done, at the grassroots level. And I see that right across the country. We have small, large Indigenous organizations, who are doing so much, for their community, through generosity and reciprocity that I know could do so much more with the right investments. And we have an organization, here in Winnipeg. Well, there are so many, but it's called the Bear Clan. And then there's one that's called the Mama Bear Clan. And so it's just based on volunteerism. And they're out a few times a week checking on brothers and sisters and, walking streets, and everybody has a role to play in ensuring that we're taking care of one another. And yeah, there's a lot to do for sure.
From a fundraising perspective, I mean, you work with a lot of Indigenous organizations. Like, what are you seeing from a fundraising perspective?
Well, I think from a fundraising perspective, part of it is communities know how to take care of one another. And so part of it is just kind of what I had to run into in realizing that, there's all these processes, things that have been set up and ways of doing things, in the fundraising sector that requires, some time to get engaged with and see where there's common ground. I see firsthand, in some of the communities, we're all trying to achieve the same thing. It's just that understanding, of gift acceptance policies, like all of these processes that have been honed in and specialized. It's right. Just understanding that, and figuring out, what's kind of common in a lot of that.
We work with a lot of small and medium-sized organizations, and systems and processes are the thing that we spend a lot of time working on organizations with that, because if you can secure funding and then struggle to receipt it and recognize it and keep the donors sort of aware of what's going on, it's easy to lose that donor as a longer term donor. So fundraising is like an iceberg, right? Like people see the donations that are made as fundraising, but really about 90% of the work is below the water in terms of all the things that we do. So I guess, are you spending much time with your clients working on that 90% under the water?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing I think is really important is, I just had this conversation with a colleague of mine yesterday about, in the fundraising sector, we define donors in a certain way, foundations, individuals. And I think that, we as an Indigenous community, we're all donors because of the fact that we're, sharing our time, our skills. I think the other thing that I learned quite a bit about is that from a cultural perspective, we're all gifted with a certain gift. And so I see that in our communities, and so it's about just framing things and elevating the strength that our communities, have been doing for thousands of years about taking care of each other and taking care of Mother Earth and, coming from that perspective. So it's a lot of, okay, so donor might mean this in this context, but it actually means this. And so it's been a growing experience for me, for sure.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting that you say that, because even the definition of who one can give a donation to is also a pretty arbitrary. Well, it's arbitrary. I mean, it's part of the Canada Revenue Agency rules, right? So I know that one of the challenges for lots of communities, not just First Nations communities, is that communities do take care of each other. And oftentimes it's just groups of volunteers who get together and take care of the community, and they're not a qualified donee. And so donors don't get a tax receipt if they give to somebody who's a non-qualified donee.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I believe it was years ago, a lot of our First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities are considered qualified donees. And I think they changed that in 2016, which kind of makes it a requirement now that they send a letter to Revenue Canada to be recognized. So it's just kind of one of those unfortunate things. And so, yeah, I think that, there are definitely some processes, and some legislation that have been set up, and they don't always work for communities. And Cathy, I have to acknowledge that, back to the time of the fact that they criminalized giving, there has been a lot of changes to legislation and to the Tax Act that I'm not sure, if consultation with our Indigenous governments have happened. Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to support systems, processes that are going to enable. And so I think there's been a lot of gaps, in the system, and a lot of decisions that have been made without the proper consultation. And there's been been some unintended consequences, of that. And so I think when we think about reframing philanthropy, it's really important to have the right people around the table and to be asking questions, and to be able to, make decisions to make sure, this whole sector can be more equitable for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly an issue. There's a lot, the stats that you shared about how much money goes to Indigenous people versus everyone else. Communities have those kinds of challenges, right? Where whether it's, members of the Black community or Muslim community, not much money is going to some smaller communities. It's disproportionately less than the size of the communities.
Yeah. And I think we can recognize that COVID has certainly made that, more challenging. We have a lot of First Nation communities, Métis and Inuit communities, that have been hit hard by COVID, and we can see, certainly the challenges of not having, affordable housing, access to clean water. A lot of them are remote. And so it's really important, that we, as a sector recognize too, that, there's always a perception for a lot of the Indigenous community that the government just pays for everything. And so that isn't the case. So I think that, it's really important for our sector to recognize that. And, I do know that the First Nation government and communities have had to take the government to court for underfunding education and, child and family services of Cindy Blackstock. And
she's a friggin' hero.
She is, and there are so many people, who have been working really hard, and will continue to work hard to raise that awareness. And so I think it's important that we change that narrative as well.
It was amazing to hear from such a powerful voice like Sharon's today. We hope that you will all connect with Sharon on LinkedIn and check out the many resources that she's provided on her site, redskyfundraising.com. If you found this podcast useful, we'd love if you'd rate and review it on Apple Podcasts. You can find this and many other resources on Fundraising Lab's website and social media. The music you heard on this podcast was Dog Days by Isaac Joel. And like Mama always said, it doesn't hurt to ask.